All right, so far, these are the steps I've gone through. I sketched an idea for my spot illustration, a free floating spot illustration. I then took that sketch into the computer and I added some things, moved it around so that it would work well from both orientations, because my idea is to kind of base it on a playing card. My idea is kind of that this is a vaccine card, so that this represents the first dose you get where there's lots of anxiety still. And then the second dose, you have the little plague mask, but you have the flower growing with the heart at the end. And then like the mask of the skull is kind of behind you. So this would indicate your first dose, this would indicate your second dose. And that's why I was playing with the idea of adding the syringe in there, which I'm still on the fence about. Maybe it's too literal. And then I brought that sketch into Photopea, into a raster program. And I onion skinned it by putting a blank white layer at 50% opacity. And then using the brush tool with solid black as my foreground color. Try to get some more space on the screen for you. I started painting the line art using a brush that was no smaller than 7 pixels and no larger than 14 pixels. And when you choose the brush tool, you can choose to have it smooth. This is something that's good to know. I don't think it's actually good or bad, but good to know about Photopea. That is different than other programs like Photoshop. When you open it on the browser and you open your file in it, it's going to default to all the original settings, right? So the smooth is now 0. It's not at the 60 or the 30 I was using before. And it's also going to default towards going thick to thin with a stylus pressure control. But I'm using a trackpad. So whenever I want something to taper like it would with the stylus, I need to use my eraser at 100% opacity and kind of trim the edges. Now, digital inking, several videos I have posted for that. It takes a while. It takes a lot of patience, just like traditional inking. And you can vary things like your line thickness. But what I did ask you to try to do, just conceptually, is to contain all your shapes as much as possible. So not to leave openings like this in shapes that you think you'll color. So you want to make sure they're closed all the way. So I have some conspicuous openings just so I can show you the difference. So mostly everything is contained except for the knife. I left that little opening because it only takes 1 pixel of opening for contiguous pixels to be selected. Okay. Then in the last video, even though I wasn't finished with all the digital inking, I put a solid white background behind, and you can see I still have a little bit of digital inking to do. And then I put in flat color. I started showing you how to put in these blocks of color behind, and that's where having a closed shape on your inking layer really helps. So you don't have to redraw edges. And then when you want to separate edges like I did here, because of course my inking is very open between here and here. There are a few different methods you can use, but basically when we're doing flat color, you sometimes just have to color it yourself with your brush tool if it doesn't go within contained shapes. You can also just use your brush to get rid of that little anti-alias buffer that's created. And I'll show you some other techniques to deal with that as well. So I'm going to leave a little bit of empty space here between. But I'm just adding on to my flat color, adding on to that brown a little bit. Okay. So I did continue with my digital inking, using the trackpad, using all the same things, and then erasing out to get some variation. Again, I'm choosing at 9 by 12 inches at 300 pixels per inch to use brushes that are between 7 pixels and 14 pixels. And so when it's little details like that, that's closer to 7 pixels. And then I can even erase out. So if I want even thinner lines than that, I just erase down to them, like that little shard right there. But I also am mindful that it doesn't make sense to zoom in more than 300%, because zooming in that much is going beyond what the eye will see in the print. So though we can, kind of like we did for our logos, obsess about every little edge, once you're beyond 300% viewing of actual pixels, I don't think it's very practical to spend your time doing that. Okay. I have left little gaps, like right there and right here in my digital inking. And I'm not sure I want to keep those, but remember, any gaps you leave, any white that's showing now has the potential to be colored later. So it could always be colored in with a dark gray, a dark blue. But anything I fill in with absolute black will not be seen as a color, right? This is called full bleed inking. And it is good to have a couple of those throughout your piece so that you get a sense of how dark the contrast can go. And for the most part, illustration is strongest when it's full contrast. Now that doesn't mean that you can't just flat color in with solid black as well. So you don't always need to do that with your inking. But I'm pretty sure I want it to be pretty dark around the star here. So if I wanted to, I could do something like this in my black ink layer. I can take my lasso, because there are more ways to ink than just using your brush tool. And I can subtract from the lasso using the magic wand and contiguous. Hold down Option and subtract the star in the middle. So it looks like this. And then using the default black, the 100% black, I can use on my black line layer the paint bucket tool and drop that in. Right. And then I can have that as part of my black line work. But here's the reason we don't use the magic wand so much, because you'll get some artifacts, right? So then I need to go in with my brush anyway and define the shapes I actually want. But it does a good job of preserving the inside edge for me. So with this video, I hope to finish my digital inking once and for all, because that's one part of the assignment you want to turn in, is just your black line art. And that's to help you separate it from your coloring as well. The biggest mistake you can make in digital coloring is to accidentally merge your color layers with your line art layers, because that just takes a lot of options away for you. Okay, So this is an example of full bleed, finding solid shapes. And I like the little bit of emphasis there. And I think I want another full bleed over here. So I'll do the same thing. I'm on my line art layer. I'll drop in some black. And then I will, kind of curious if my selection would leave any less of an artifact if I had anti-alias turned off. And it's about the same. It's supposed to help, but and I don't want to feather this selection because I want everything on the black line layer to be 100% opaque. So I just let the brush create the slight softness at the edge, which is giving us this little artifact. Hopefully that all makes sense as you can apply it to your own work. Okay, so now I've got some nice full bleed areas. Next, actually I see one more that would be helpful. And some artists don't like to do this because it kind of simplifies their work. But in my opinion, it kind of gives the opportunity to really help your coloring. So I would encourage establishing, at least one full bleed shape. So you have a darkest dark there to influence your coloring. And then some of my favorite artists, like Mignola, so Mignola is the kind of independent comic artist of Hellboy. And his artwork, he does the pencils and inks for his artwork, and he's kind of well known for really heavy full bleed inking. And his colorist, which is usually Dave Stewart, who does digital color over his work, is able to use that full bleed inking, these really strong black shapes, and keep the color pretty simple and yet really supportive. So some wonderful kind of spot illustration examples here. So the more full bleed your inking is, kind of the simpler your color can be. And then the thinner your inking is, the more complicated your coloring often has to be. So there's a relationship between the line weight and the complexity of the coloring that's going to come next. So I'm kind of in between there. All right. Now, something that's important, I have a color layer, right? I want to make sure everything stays separate. So I want to lock every other layer that I don't want to impact, because mistakes can happen very easily. So as I finish my inking, I'm going to turn off the solid white layer. I'm just going to zoom in. This is just for a review. I'm going to go to my brush tool and I'm going to turn my smoothness on to about 60, I think. I have it at, I was doing full bleed inking, so I went beyond my 14 pixel limit. So I'm going to try it maybe at about 12 pixels. And the smoothness just helps keep the jitter out of my hand. But now that I've been digitally inking with these settings for a while, even just with the trackpad, I'm a little bit more comfortable with it. And when I kind of jog and it's not as smooth as I want, I use my eraser in kind of big arcs. It's usually on curves where I tend to make mistakes like that. and I kind of carved them out. And what that does is give